Lynn Goldman. I am the board chair for Jewish Fertility Foundation. I'm one of the founding members of the Jewish Fertility Foundation. And I'm also a fertility and adoption attorney here in Atlanta, Georgia. And just a little bit about me and why I joined Jewish Fertility Foundation. I also went through many years of fertility treatments myself here in Atlanta. I have twins that are 18 now, going off to college. But for me, I really wanted to give back to people that were going through a similar journey that I was, and it was so hard. And I just wanted to be able to help other people that are going through it. So go ahead, Rachel.
And also your video now looks great.
Perfect.
Yes. So my name is Rachel Loftspring. I am a fertility law attorney at Essig & Evans. We are a boutique family and fertility law firm in Cincinnati, Ohio. So as part of that, like Lynn, I counsel intended parents and surrogates and recipients and gamete donors in family building through assisted reproductive technology. And my clients are in the United States, from around the world. They are married, they are single, and they are of all sexual orientations. And a little bit about why I joined JFF. So it actually has everything to do with Lynn. We were at ASRM together, which is American Society of Reproductive Medicine. We were at a conference that they had in Denver, I think, and Lynn was telling me about this amazing organization that exists in Georgia, and I just kept thinking to myself, this is something that we need to have in Cincinnati. The Jewish communities are very similar between Atlanta and Cincinnati, and there was such a need for it. And so almost 2 years ago, Lynn, Alana Frank, who's the executive director, and I got on the phone and we started talking about what this could look like. Fast forward to today, and the Cincinnati office is open. We have an amazing advisory board. We have a great new rabbinic intern, and we are providing emotional support through buddy programs. So matching those who have gone through infertility with those who are now experiencing it. We have virtual support groups, and we also are giving out fertility grants for those going through IVF and IUI. And a lot of that's similar to what you're doing in Atlanta as well.
Exactly. So in Atlanta, same as in Cincinnati, we have fertility buddies that we've matched buddies with people going through fertility actively. And then we also have lots of support groups. We're doing a lot of online support groups right now because of COVID. And we are also giving out fertility grants to those going through IVF and IUI.
Great. So as we get started, Lynn and I want to give a little disclaimer. We're attorneys, so we can't help it. And that is that this is not legal advice. This is for general consumption. And you should speak to an attorney if you have specific questions. And that also surrogacy and gamete donation, which we're talking about today, and fertility law in general, it varies dramatically state by state. So Lynn and I will talk a little bit about specifics with our own states, but each state is different. And so as people are joining us from around the country, perhaps even broader, know that a lot depends on the jurisdiction that you're in.
And also the jurisdiction where your gametes might be coming from. So that's important too. So yeah. Okay, so the first thing we're going to start off with is what is gamete donation? Gamete donation is just a fancy way of saying egg, sperm, or embryo donation. And so it can be any of those three, but just for a catch-all phrase, it's gamete. We use the term gamete.
Right. And little biology, and we are not doctors, but this is pretty basic. The egg is the female reproductive cell, the sperm is the male reproductive cell, and when they combine, when there's fertilization of the egg by the sperm, we have an embryo, which is the first stage in human development.
Great. All right, so just to kind of tell you where, if you are looking to get donor gametes from, there's several different ways that you can look for donor gametes. There are banks like sperm banks, egg banks, and even embryo banks that have eggs, sperm, or embryos, and you can get them from that bank. It can be an anonymous donation or a non-anonymous donation, and we'll talk a little bit more about about anonymous and not anonymous and how anonymous things really are in reality. But then you can also get gametes from an agency. So there are agencies for egg donor agencies, embryo donor that will match you with somebody that is looking to donate their eggs or their embryos. And then the other option is to find someone independently that is looking to donate their embryos or their eggs or their sperms. But I would tell you that if you're doing independent, you're going to want to have a contract, and we'll talk about a contract. If you're working with a bank, they usually have their own contracts that they work with. Or if you're working with an agency, a lot of agencies will hire attorneys to draft contracts as well.
Great. So Lynn and I thought it'd be helpful also to talk a little bit about the prerequisites for donation. And there are different ones, although they have a similar flavor depending on who you are. So if you are the person donating a gamete, you are going to be screened based on the most recent guidelines from the FDA and from ASRM, again, American Society of Reproductive Medicine. You're going to be asked to complete an extensive medical questionnaire that's going to ask you about personal and family medical history. You're also going to have an exam, and you're going to have mental health screening and counseling. In addition, for recipients, you're also going to be asked about your medical history, might be some laboratory screening for you too, an exam, also medical health screening consultation. Within these pieces, some of that can be screening for genetic disease or issues that could come up as well. And then finally, if you are donating an embryo, there will be an embryology report, which will talk about the quality of the embryo. And then also, if you are donating an embryo, remember that contains both sperm and egg. So you need to know that you have the consent of both the egg provider and the sperm provider in order to move forward with the donation.
Great. So now we're going to talk about different laws that exist both in Georgia and in Ohio. So we'll start with Georgia first. Georgia has very little fertility law. Actually, the only statute that we actually have on our books in Georgia pertains to embryo donation. Embryo donation is part of our laws here, and it can be affected through a contract. Even though we don't have sperm or egg donation laws in Georgia, you're still able to do sperm donation or egg donation, and it's through a contract, transferring ownership from one person to another. So what about Ohio?
Great. So we also don't have a ton of law, statutory law, about fertility law. So when it comes to sperm donation, that said, when it comes to sperm donation, we do have statutory law, and it only applies to a woman who is being inseminated by somebody who is not her husband. So if the husband is providing the sperm, he is not a donor. He is the parent. The law does not apply, and it also doesn't apply to surrogacy. So we handle that when we do a surrogacy in a little bit differently. And the law has several requirements, including the fact that a doctor either has to be involved or oversee things. So do it yourself does not count as sperm donation. It actually has to be medical. And if you follow the statutory law, then the woman who delivers the child is considered, from a legal standpoint, the mother. Her spouse is considered the other parent, and the donor is considered to have no parental rights. Egg donation in Ohio, we do not have laws, so we look at it as kind of a spectrum. So it starts with the consent that your egg donor would sign at the clinic. After that, we have just the presumption that the woman who delivers the child under Ohio statutory law is presumed to be the mother. Then we have a contract, and It's not required in Ohio to have a contract, but there are certainly situations, and this goes kind of with all egg, sperm, and embryo donation, that it would make sense to have a contract, especially if it's known, so that you can better define what the relationship will look like. But we can still do contracts if it's unknown, and that seems to be something that there's sometimes confusion about, that people say, oh no, I don't have a contract because my donor is unknown. That's not necessarily the case. You can have a contract. And then beyond that, we could get a court order on the spectrum of egg donor. And then finally, embryo donation. We do actually have statutory law on that as well. It does not apply to surrogacy, so it must be that the woman who is the recipient of the embryo is the woman who's delivering, and then she and her spouse, assuming consent, are considered the parents, and the donor is not.
Okay. One thing I do want to add about Georgia law, one thing I forgot to mention is we do have a law in our book that's pretty interesting, is that our laws do not allow you to do an IUI, insemination, at home. Do it yourself. It has to be done through a doctor or a medical provider. So that's one thing to note. But with any of our gamete donation, you're going to want to have a contract that not only spells out ownership transfer, but also it'll also state, and our embryo donation statute says it too, is that once those gametes are transferred and you have a transfer and you're pregnant and you give birth, the recipient of those gametes is the parent. So, and that's regardless whether it's, surrogacy or not. So if it's surrogacy, you're going to have a separate contract talking about parentage and the intended parents or the parents, and you're going to actually get a parentage court order in our state. So we're not going to go into surrogacy right now, but just to let you know that.
Perfect. And I see questions. That's fantastic. Keep them coming. I think we're going to hold them until the end. So make sure to remind us about what the topic is, and we will do our best to answer them if we don't hit them in our discussion. Okay, should we talk about contracts?
Sure, let's do it. All right, so like we keep talking about, you're gonna wanna have a contract. So what we would recommend to you is that any contract that you have drafted, that it be drafted by an attorney, and you want it to be drafted by an attorney that specifically specializes in assisted reproduction technology law. And so you can actually find attorneys in your state. There's something called the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproduction Attorneys. And you can actually search on there by state to find an attorney in your state. So that's a great place to look for an attorney. And again, that contract, really the purpose of it is to transfer ownership and to spell out that any child that results from that donation is the child of the recipient of those gametes. And one thing to note, I touched on it a minute ago about anonymity. Even if your donor chooses to remain anonymous, because of 23andMe and lots of other ways, the internet and things like that, anonymous is not always anonymous. You may think that you want to start out anonymous, but just know it doesn't always remain anonymous. And you've probably heard lots of news stories about that. So I just want to let you know that that's not always the case. And maybe if your child grows up and wants to find out where their genetics came from, there's things like donor sibling registries, there's 23andMe, there's ways for them to be able to find that out. So you just want to make sure that you know that it's not always anonymous. So I think that's important to touch on. So we're going to dive into what is in that contract in each of our states. So go ahead, Rachel.
Exactly. And to Lynn's point about what is anonymous, one thing to keep in mind is there are two parties to the agreement. There are the parents or the recipients, one or two, and then you have the donor and his or her spouse if married. And they are working out this agreement and setting up the framework in which to do this. But there is an important party that is not the party to the contract, and that is the donor conceived person. And so the donor conceived person is not restricted or limited or at all guided by the contract. And so that donor conceived person who is a baby at first and then grows up, today it's a matter of swabbing a cheek and finding out information. When we started to be able to do this, and people who had donated previously and thought that anonymous was a thing and this kind of technology wasn't even on the radar, this has been really difficult. Now we can have these conversations and let people know, look, that this is a real possibility. And then also, who knows what the technology is going to be 5, 10, 20 years down the road, when a child who a recipient might have is now an adult and making these decisions.
And that's a great point. So one thing also that is typically put in a contract is any remaining gametes that you might have after you're done building your family, what should be the disposition of those gametes? So, and one thing that I would tell you is you're going to want to spell that out in a contract, whether it's that you want to donate them to another family, whether you want to discard them, or whether you want to donate them to science, or if you want to donate them to the fertility clinic to then donate to another family. And you want to make sure that that is agreed upon and spelled out in the contract. And one thing I do want to mention, if you are receiving donor embryos that are made with donor egg, you want to make sure that if they are made with donor egg, that the donor egg contract actually allows for redonation, so that if you have any remaining embryos remaining and the plan is for you to donate the remaining embryos to another family, you want to make sure that redonation is allowed. So you want to go back and look at that egg donation contract that existed before those embryos were made. So that's really important to do. And you want to make sure that anything that is in the contract regarding disposition once once you've built your family is consistent with what you fill out at your fertility clinic. So at your fertility clinic, you're going to fill out a lot of forms about any remaining embryos that might exist. Do you want to keep them cryopreserved? Do you want to discard them? Do you want to donate to another family? Just make sure that what you put on record with your fertility clinic is also what's in your contract, and vice versa. You don't want to have inconsistent documents. If you need to update one, update the other, or make it known that one is superseding the other one. Okay.
Perfect. And we also, I see a note there from your colleague, always want to make sure that our will is consistent with what we are putting.
Thank you. Yes, that is true as well. So that is my colleague. Thank you, Lila. So that she's exactly right. She drafts a lot of trust and estate work, and she's exactly right. So if you have a will, and we would highly recommend if you are creating embryos or if you have any donor gametes or any gametes at all, that you need to have a will. And in that will, you need to spell out what should happen if you or your spouse dies, what happens with those gametes, who owns them, who's going to remain paying for cryopreservation. And again, it needs to be consistent with what's on record at the fertility clinic, and also what's in your contract with the donor, the gamete donation. So all of those documents need to be consistent, so that there's no question about which one is the correct choice for you.
Great.
Yeah.
Another thing in our contracts that we talk about is a future release of information. And this can be anonymous or not, but one big one is health information. And so what I'm thinking about specifically here is if your donor, or if your child, or that person later becomes a donor conceived person, something comes up that is genetic, where information from the other person could be helpful. Sometimes contracts provide a means, even if it's anonymous, to contact one another and provide that information. There is specifically no requirement for somebody to then also donate, for example, blood or organ or bone marrow, but just to have that information. There's also provisions for the release of identifying information, but also heritage information, so that the donor conceived person can learn more about their heritage. Then when this happens, if it's anonymous, oftentimes the broker or the matching program or the fertility clinic serves as the go-between between the two parties. It's also important to keep in mind that it is possible down the road that there could be a court order or a change in law even that requires the release of identifying information. There are countries now in Europe, for example, where a donor-conceived person is given the information about their donor at a certain age. And this is certainly what's been happening in adoption law as well in this country. We also include what would happen if the parties find out about one another in terms of sharing information more broadly, or if it's known, what kind of information they can share about each other more broadly.
Right. And one thing that sometimes we also include, sometimes the donor wants to know if the recipient becomes pregnant or has a child. They just want to be notified so that they know. So sometimes we'll also include that in a contract as well.
Mm-hmm.
So. The other thing that we'll include in a contract is we put in there, if these are already created gametes and they're already cryopreserved, we'll put in there when the storage fees are due, so that the recipient can then take over the storage fee cost, the expenses for that. So we'll put that in there. And also the other thing that we'll put in there is if it's, say, for example, an egg donation or sperm donation, any expenses that need to be paid to that donor. And again, they're not paying for the genetic material. They are paying for any expenses. So any medical expenses, any travel expenses, any pain and suffering that they might have, but they are not paying for that genetic material.
Right. And I did see a couple of questions, I think, about how much a contract costs. And that's going to be dependent lawyer to lawyer. It's going to depend on jurisdiction. You know, you want to get somebody who has done this before, because it is a very nuanced area. And the recipient is going to cover the cost of their own attorney fees, and then also generally the legal costs of their donor as well. Yeah. Another thing we talk about is acknowledging and understanding that it is possible that the quality of the egg or the sperm or the embryo might not be as hoped. If it's an egg retrieval, you might not get as many or any eggs. If it is a situation where you are using a donor gamete and then using your own to create an embryo, you might not end up with embryos as you have hoped. You might not be able to get pregnant with the embryo. And then of course, there's always the chance that you could have a child with some sort of limitation. So we talk about all of that in the agreement as well.
Right. And sometimes embryos or eggs, if they're frozen, don't always thaw as we would want them to be. So there's that knowledge as well. But I do tell people, before you start down the road of a contract with somebody, you really want to look at their embryology report, if it's an embryo, to know what that quality looks like. But again, even if the quality is good, there's still some things that can happen along the way. So that's really important to know. I also tell people that you want to know how those embryos are stored. Are they stored 1 per test tube? Are they stored 2 per test tube? So that you know what that looks like. Because sometimes you might, the donor might say, I'll donate 3 out of 6 of my embryos to you. And if that's the case, that's fine. But if they're stored in the same test tubes, there might be a problem, because you can't thaw out those embryos and then rethaw and refreeze them. So you just want to know how they're frozen as well. And you're going to want to put into the contract which specific embryos that you're getting, so their identification numbers.
Great. You know, something that comes up a lot in conversation for me is talking about the rights and the interests that everybody involved in this arrangement have. And what we know is that we have recipients who will be parents, we have donors, and then we have people who are donor conceived. And each of these groups have very intimate, very personal, very legitimate interests and rights. And unfortunately, sometimes these conflict. So I thought it would be helpful to lay out what some of these are. Of course, every individual is different, and this is a great discussion to for your mental health professional who is talking you through this. And this is why I think it's so important for both donors and recipients to have these discussions, because it's a lot, and it's lifelong. So when I think about a donor conceived person and what kind of interest they might have, I mean, obviously they have an interest in being healthy and being able to take preventative measures if they learn something based on their genetics related to health. They have an interest in knowing their genetic origins, or in knowing the donor and the identity of the donor, and that could come in direct conflict with the wishes of the donor, who may wish to remain anonymous, or maybe the donor's never even told his or her family that this is something that they did. And this could also conflict with the wishes of the donor conceived person's parents, who maybe have a different thought about what this would look like. And then the donor conceived person may also have an interest in contacting their donor. And again, this could be something that conflicts with the donor or the donor conceived person's parents, or it might be something that's welcome. Every situation is different, but this is where sometimes we see these things play out.
Yeah. And one thing to note for the donor is to know that once you donate those gametes, your ownership over those gametes ends. So then any child that results is those of the recipient of those gametes. So understand that you do lose that control over your gametes once you've donated them. Same thing with any of your family members as well. So just, that's one thing to understand. And, the other thing to know is, just like Rachel said, is that, you may want this to be anonymous, but it may not end up being that way. So that's an important thing to know for yourself as well as your children, because they might learn that, there are some biological, siblings out there. And so just know that it has an impact on, the donor's children as well. And that's something to take into consideration.
Right.
So.
And then just to touch on some of the interests that the recipient or the parents might have, they have an interest in having a healthy child. They might have an interest in knowing certain attributes about the donor, so whether that's physical or psychological or cognitive. They have an interest in defining their family relationship, and also the relationship or lack thereof with the donor. They are going to have an interest in knowing the family and health history of the donor, and also in the past behavior of the donor, if that behavior could impact the quality of the egg sperm or resulting embryo. And then they might have an interest, as I mentioned, about future release of health information. They might have an interest in knowing future health updates from the donor.
So one thing also that we want to talk about is, how is COVID impacting all of this? So just to talk about that for a second, some of the fertility clinics around the country have been closed for a little bit, and now they're slowly coming back open again. And just, talk about how that might impact gamete donation. So if there are frozen gametes that are stored at one clinic and they need to be transferred to another, sometimes what's going on with COVID can impact that. There can be a delay in getting those gametes from one location to another. Also, there might be a delay in your fertility treatment, in cycles and in transfers, and in creating embryos. So there is some delays. There's also some staffing shortage right now with our fertility clinic because of COVID, so that's slowing things down. So just know that. But also, I just want to mention, there's a couple ways if you have gametes frozen at one fertility clinic and you're transferring them to another. There are companies like CryoStork. There's also sometimes people use even FedEx to transfer, gametes from one location to the other. It's important to make sure that your fertility clinic will accept gametes from one location to another, because there's some FDA requirements regarding that. So you just want to make sure before you accept those gametes that your clinic is going to accept them into their lab. So.
Great.
Yeah.
Should we discuss embryo donation as opposed to adoption? Oh, I think I'm losing Lynn, so I'll go first. Do you want to go first? You want to talk
Yeah.
about Georgia? Because Georgia's kind of unique.
Yeah. You guys can hear me, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. I just want to make sure. Okay. So in Georgia, we do, like I said, we have an embryo donation statute. The statute actually says that an embryo donation can happen through a contract, but if the parties want a parentage order or an adoption, we can do that in Georgia. So we can do that either prior to birth or after birth. So just to let you know that as well. It's not required, but it's allowed. So it's something you can do, but you don't have to do it. You can effectuate the donation just through the contract, or you can take this extra step.
And
so, oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead. And so I was going to say, you know, we hear embryo donation, and sometimes it's just kind of the term embryo adoption is used interchangeably, and I want to point out that they are not the same thing. So generally speaking, adoption is very state by state statutory, and it's a complex legal process that's done by state. And so, for example, in Ohio, there is no such thing as embryo adoption. There is only embryo donation. So in adoption, you have a judicial order that terminates parental rights and gives parental rights to somebody else. So it requires that, or orphan, or abandon. And that is not the case with donation. In donation and ASRM and some of the other organizations, you know, we think about embryos as something that has a special status because it could become human, but it is not yet human, and as such, it doesn't go through the adoption process. We think about it more akin to what would happen in unassisted conception, and giving the parents the privacy that they would otherwise have. And we think about embryo adoption. We think about that as not something that we do in Ohio. We think about embryo donation as much more akin to unassisted conception.
So one thing that we wanted to talk about is, you know, telling your child, your future child, about gamete donation and how they were created. And one thing that most psychologists will tell you, and all psychologists that I know that I've ever talked to in Georgia, I don't know about you, Rachel, but most psychologists will say that it's important to tell your child how they came to be early and often. And in a way that is child friendly. And they're just, you know, you can tell them in a way that is, you know, meaningful to them, but is very much age appropriate. There's great books out there that you can use to tell them, and the mental health professional that you might be working with on this gamete donation, you might want to talk to them about what's the best way to tell my future child. And when do I tell them, and how do I tell them? So they're a great resource for that. There's also some great books that a psychologist that used to practice here in Atlanta has written. Her name is Linda Stam, and she wrote some great children's books on gamete donation that you can, you know, read aloud to your future child. You can find them on Amazon or anywhere else. That's one great resource that we refer our clients to a lot. But again, it's important to let your child know because it's important for their own identity, but it's also important because, going back to what we talked about, you know, anonymous is not always anonymous. So it's important to let them know very early on. So,
and you can visit the Jewish Fertility Foundation website for suggested reading, like what Lynn has said. Thanks, Alana. One of the questions that came up prior to today, and then I think I can also combine one that happened, is what about for folks who are LGBTQ and gamete donation, embryo donation? For me in Ohio, the question was special considerations. For me in Ohio, the biggest issue is whether the recipients are married. If they are married, I have a lot more ability within our legal framework than if they are not married, because the woman who has the child is presumed the mother, and her spouse is presumed the other parent. If I don't have somebody else genetically providing the material, it can get a little complicated. Some things we can do, some things we can't do, and so that's, at least in my mind, quite a jurisdictional issue. Lynn?
Yeah. So in Georgia, that is the same for us in Georgia, but that's across the board, whether it's an LGBT family or, you know, a heterosexual family. If the parties aren't married, it makes things a little bit more complicated to make sure to have legal parentage declared. But it doesn't mean it can't be done. It just takes some extra steps. But that's across the board, whether heterosexual or LGBT.
And the reason for that is the Supreme Court case of Embryo, which says that we treat married couples the same, whether they are heterosexual or homosexual. A little plug from my partner in my law firm, Ellen Essig, was actually on the Embryo team, so we are very proud of that in my neck of the woods.
Yeah. Well, great.
Questions that we had.
Sure. So, let's see. Another question was, what makes a couple prioritize for embryo donation over another? And what I would say is that it's not really about priority. It's about matching, and it's matching what you might be looking for in an embryo with what a recipient might be looking for in a donor. And so, you know, you might have some specifics, whether it be about genetic or medical history or features and character traits, and same thing for the donor. They might have some of those as well. And so it's more about matching up those items, as well as, you know, how many donors are there out there and how many recipients are there out there that are looking to receive a donation. So it's more about that than priorities. So that's what how I would answer it. What about you?
I was looking up real quick a website because somebody asked to mention again the Academy of Adoption and Assisted Reproductive Attorneys. The URL is Adoption Art, Assisted Reproductive Technology, so adoptionart.org. And this, like Lynn said, is a great resource to find attorneys. We're both fellows. Any attorney who is listed on that site has been thoroughly vetted, and I can promise you it was a thorough vetting because we went through it, and it was very intense. And it's also something that I think I speak for both of us. We are extremely proud to be members of. These are some of the most wonderful and expert attorneys in the field.
Yes, and just know, if you're looking up an attorney on the Academy list, on the Academy website, you're going to look by your state, but also when you look at all the attorneys listed, they will either say adoption or art or both. So if you're looking specifically for a fertility attorney, you want to make sure that they have art by their name, because that means that they've been admitted to the Academy for a specialty in assisted reproduction. And then there's some people like myself that have art and adoption. So you'll just want to make sure you can check that out.
Okay, so here's another question. With COVID and difficulty of egg donors traveling, if someone does FET and donation out of state, but delivers in home state, which state of both guide parentage and rights? Do you want that?
Nope, I'll let you take that one.
So jurisdictional issues come up a lot. I see this a lot in my surrogacy practice as well. You know, we have intended parents, they live out of state. The gestational carrier is in state, so we base it on that. It's not always totally clear what it is, but I tend to start with where the delivery is going to happen, because that's where parentage is going to occur. But I also never think it hurts to, and certainly when there's a contract involved, get an attorney in both states or all the states where the situation is happening, so that we can discuss and really think it through and have a better understanding of what that could look like.
Right. And one thing that we also try to do is, especially if we have another attorney on the other side that's in the other state, is to evaluate both states' laws and see if we want to put the contract that it's governed by both states.
Right.
And we'll put what both states' laws are in that contract.
Yeah, that's a really good point. You have enforceability of the contract, and then you also have parentage, and those could be handled in two different ways if one state is better than the other.
Yeah.
That's where attorneys like us start geeking out. Alana keeps asking us about costs. We're not saying this on purpose, Alana, because it's so different. You know, it's a different cost to draft versus to review. It's going to vary state by state. So the recipient is going to pay for both. um, the drafting, and then also for the donors generally.
And what you're paying for is you're paying for one of the attorneys is going to draft the contract, and the other attorney is going to review the contract on behalf of their client. And there may be some edits or changes that they want to happen, and there may be some minor negotiations about some issues, but that's really what you're paying each of the attorneys for. So when you're looking at costs, there are two separate costs. There are costs for your legal fees for both the donor and the recipient, but then there's also what you're paying your fertility clinic for the medical process, and any type of expenses that you're paying for your donor. So if you're paying any travel expenses, any kind of you know medications, things like that. So it's not just legal costs, and I would argue that your legal costs are the most affordable.
Right, they're small. And they do tend to be flat rate. That's kind of how it works across the board with us. Yes. Oh, the other thing I wanted to point out, yes, somebody had asked about whether you pay for embryos. No, and this is the case across the board, you are paying for the expenses. So whether it's pain and suffering, if you're going through an egg retrieval or other expenses, we are not actually paying for genetic material.
Right. So, and for an embryo donation, what you're paying for is the legal fees for both parties. You may be paying for any transport of those embryos from one clinic to another. You also might be paying for any taking over any cryopreservation fees that the donor may have for you to take over.
Okay, here's a question on independent legal advice. So some of this might vary jurisdiction to jurisdiction based on whether you even need a contract, but it is always my opinion that when you have one party represented by legal counsel, the other party should have their own independent legal counsel. And, you know, it's kind of not the time to skimp. If there was ever a problem down the road, it would be easy for your donor to claim that he or she wasn't represented by counsel where you were. So I do think it is worth it in certain cases, like for example, surrogacy. I would never, ever, ever do a contract where both parties aren't independently represented. And just to clarify on that independent piece as well. So I work with somebody else in my law firm, and we would never do both sides. So if I'm representing the gestational carrier in that situation, it would need to go outside of my law firm for the intended parents and vice versa. That's what I mean by independent.
Yeah, exactly. So our law firm has an office in Atlanta and an office in North Carolina. And even if I was working on an embryo donation of embryos being donated by a North Carolina couple and the embryo donor lives in Georgia, I would never work with my law partner for her to represent one party and I represent the other, because it's a conflict. But I always tell people the other reason why it's important for both parties to have independent counsel is, just like Rachel said, is that, you know, if you are, let's say, receiving the embryos or you're donating the embryos, it's a protection for you as much as the other party, because that way you're assured that the other party absolutely understood what is in that contract. There can be no doubt that, you know, they didn't have an opportunity to ask questions. They didn't have an opportunity to negotiate what they wanted to be in that contract. So it's a protection from, you know, for you as well as for them. So, and again, it's not, your legal contracts are not where you want to skip.
And I would also suggest that a legal contract is just not a bunch of mumbo jumbo. You know, hopefully we've explained well some of the things that you could see in a contract. I know whenever I draft a contract or review a contract with a client, we sit down for several hours sometimes and we go through it page by page. And I have already made sure that they've read it. I make sure that it's in front of them, and we talk through it. I highlight important topics, of which there are many. I make sure that all their questions are answered, and also if I have any questions, especially if it's a more complicated situation about the setup, making sure that everything is correct in that contract, because that contract is going to control. So it also gives you the time to really have an understanding of what's going on here. The devil's in the details, and that's your contract phase. I very often have clients who say, "Oh, I didn't realize that," or "I had no idea how this was set up." And so it's helpful too. It's kind of an important process step, I would say.
Yeah. And I always have clients that say to me, and they'll often say, "Oh, I didn't think about that," or "I would have never thought of that." And that's part of what the contract phase is, to be able to help you think through all of the issues. But I also have clients that are ready to keep moving with their fertility journey. So they'll come to me and say, "I just need you to spit out a contract. Just rip it off your notepad and hand it to me." But that's not how it works, because as Rachel said, it's very, very customized to your situation, and to your needs. So it is not just a form I can just spit out for you. There's a lot of time that goes into it, and customization.
Right. And I'll have people come up to me and also say, "Hey, I've got this contract. Can we just use this and you represent me in it?" And for ethical reasons, I won't do that. That's somebody else's contract. I can't take that. But also, you need to start with the match that is at hand, because there are so many specifics to each situation.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking to see if we had any other questions. Any questions that you got, Rachel?
I see one. Oh, do you have different questions than me? Does known donation jeopardize potential establishment of parentage compared to anonymous?
Not in Georgia. No, it does not. What about in Ohio?
Yeah.
Same. Okay. Then there's one other question we got is, where do we stand when compensating couples for their embryos? And again, you're not compensating that couple for those embryos, because you're not purchasing genetic material. You're compensating them. You're actually reimbursing them for any costs. So whether it be the cryopreservation, again, whether it be the legal work, any travel expenses, transporting those embryos, things like that.
Great. So I'm going to wrap it. Thank you all so much for joining. And thank you for those later who look at this video. If we didn't get to your questions, or if you have other questions, feel free to get in touch with us. Again, it's not necessarily specific legal advice, but we will do our best. You can reach out to Emily at jewishfertilityfoundation.org. Yes, we will save it to IGTV. And then you can reach out to me. I'm at Fertility Law Attorney on Instagram. You can direct message me. And Lynn?
Yep. So our law firm is Claiborne, Fox, Bradley, Goldman. You can find us on Facebook. And also our surrogacy agency is Southern Surrogacy. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram. And then I also just want to mention that Jewish Fertility Foundation also has another live webinar for parents of donor-conceived children. It's going to have 4 panelists, and it's going to be on August 13th. And you want to sign up now on our Jewish Fertility Foundation website.
Great. Lynn, it was so fun chatting with you.
Thanks. It was so fun. It was fun to have our first
everyone.
Instagram.
Bye.